The room went silent the moment his fingers touched the keys. Not the respectful kind of silence, the cruel kind. The kind that waits for failure like wolves wait for the weakest deer to fall behind. He could hear them breathing, waiting. He could feel their smirks burning into the back of his neck like cigarette burns on skin. And when the first note rang out, tentative, almost apologetic, someone in the third row laughed. Not a chuckle. A full, throat-deep laugh that echoed off the walls of that cramped community center like a slap across the face. His name was Daniel Moss, 43 years old, hands that trembled when he held them still. A man who had spent 2 decades working the night shift at a plastics factory, breathing in fumes that settled in his lungs like ash, going home to an empty apartment that smelled like instant coffee and regret. He had no credentials, no conservatory training, no pedigree. What he had was a second-hand piano he'd bought for $200 from a garage sale, keys yellowed like old teeth, and a dream that everyone around him treated like a joke. The laugh in the third row was just the beginning. Another one joined in. Then another. The sound spread through the audience like a virus, and Daniel's fingers froze above the keys. His whole body went rigid. For a moment he looked like he might stand up, apologize, and walk out of that room forever. His eyes found the floor. His breathing quickened. The laughter grew louder, but he didn't leave. Something happened in that moment, something quiet and dangerous. His jaw clenched, his shoulders squared, and his fingers, those factory-worn, trembling fingers, pressed down on the keys again. Harder this time, more certain. The melody that emerged wasn't perfect. It stumbled in places. It cracked like his voice cracked when he was nervous. But it was real, raw, honest, and it cut through the laughter like a knife through silk. The room didn't go silent because they were moved. Not yet. They went silent because they were confused. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to fail. He was supposed to prove them right. The middle-aged factory worker with the impossible dream, the punchline, the cautionary tale. But the music kept coming. Note after note, phrase after phrase. And slowly, against their will, they started to listen. Daniel had discovered the piano late in life, 38 years old. Most people his age were settling into the rhythm of their limitations, accepting that the dreams of youth were just that, dreams meant to fade like photographs left too long in the sun. But Daniel had walked past a music store one afternoon during his lunch break, and through the window he'd seen a child playing. The kid couldn't have been more than 7. Small hands dancing across the keys with the kind of freedom that only comes from not knowing failure yet. And Daniel had stood there on the sidewalk, frozen, feeling something crack open inside his chest. A longing so profound it made him dizzy. He'd never played an instrument, never read music. His parents had been practical people who believed in paychecks and pension plans, not in pianos and pipe dreams. His father had worked construction for 40 years, came home with concrete dust in his lungs and beer on his breath, and told Daniel the same thing every day. The world doesn't owe you nothing, boy. You work, you survive, you die. That's it. His mother had cleaned houses for wealthy families, coming home exhausted, hands red and raw from chemicals, never complaining but never dreaming either. They'd taught Daniel to be grateful for a steady job, to not reach for things that weren't meant for people like them. When he told his older brother Marcus about wanting to learn piano, Marcus had looked at him like he'd announced he was joining the circus. They were sitting in Marcus's pristine living room. Marcus had done well for himself, climbed the corporate ladder, married a woman who wore pearls to brunch, and Marcus had actually laughed. "At your age," he'd said, shaking his head, ice clinking in his whiskey glass, "man, you missed that boat. That boat sailed when you were 7. You're 40. You work nights at a factory. Be realistic. Realistic." That word haunted Daniel for weeks. It showed up in his thoughts at 3 in the morning when he couldn't sleep. The hum of his refrigerator, the only sound in the darkness. It whispered to him during his shift when his hands ached, and his back screamed and the conveyor belt kept moving with mechanical indifference. Realistic. It meant accepting that his life was already written, that the best chapters were behind him, though when Daniel looked back, he couldn't remember any chapters that felt particularly good. Just years blending into each other like watercolors in rain. Realistic meant that dreams had expiration dates, and his had expired decades ago, if they'd ever existed at all. But he bought the piano anyway. The garage sale was in a neighborhood nicer than his, lawns manicured, houses with 2-car garages and basketball hoops. An elderly woman was selling her late husband's things, and the piano sat in the driveway like an orphan, out of place among the golf clubs and old record players. It was a small upright walnut veneer peeling at the edges, several keys sticking when pressed. The woman wanted $500. Daniel had $200 in cash, his grocery money for the month. She looked at him, really looked at him, saw something in his face maybe, and said, okay. Getting it into his 3rd-floor apartment was its own ordeal. The building had no elevator. Daniel and 2 guys from the factory hauled it up the narrow stairwell, sweating, cursing, the piano banging against walls and leaving scuff marks. His neighbors came out, watched, made comments. Mrs. Chen from 3B asked if he was starting a moving company. Old Mr. Rodriguez asked if he knew how to play. When Daniel said he was learning, Mr. Rodriguez had smirked. Good luck with that, mijo. Don't quit your day job. The first time he sat down in front of it in his tiny living room, he felt ridiculous. The piano took up nearly a quarter of the space, dominating the room like an accusation. His furniture was second-hand, mismatched. The couch had a stain he couldn't get out. The coffee table was made from a door and cinder blocks. And now this piano, this symbol of something he had no right to want. His fingers didn't know where to go. The keys felt foreign and unforgiving under his touch, like trying to speak a language he'd never heard. He pulled up YouTube tutorials on his cracked phone screen, the one with the spiderweb fracture across the corner because he couldn't afford to replace it. A young woman with perfect posture and even more perfect teeth explained middle C, explained finger positions, explained scales. Daniel tried to follow along, but his brain couldn't make sense of the patterns. His hands wouldn't cooperate. They were factory hands, used to gripping and lifting and operating machinery, not to the delicate articulation required for piano. After an hour, he'd managed to play a C major scale, badly, haltingly, each note a separate struggle, and his neighbors had already banged on the wall twice telling him to shut up. He sat there in the dark after turning off the lights, hands in his lap, the piano looming in front of him like a monument to his own foolishness. He thought about Marcus, about his parents, about every person who'd ever told him to stay in his lane, and he wondered if they were right, if this was just a midlife crisis, if he was just a fool chasing something that was never meant for him. He could have quit that night, should have, maybe, sold the piano for whatever he could get, used the money to fix his phone, moved on, forgotten the whole thing, let it become another story he'd tell himself about things he'd tried and failed at. But the next evening, after his shift, after the scalding shower that never quite washed away the chemical smell, after the microwave dinner eaten standing at the counter, he sat down at the keys again. And the evening after that, and the one after that. Not because it was easy, not because he was good, not because anyone encouraged him, but because when he played, even badly, even with his neighbors banging on the walls, even with his fingers stumbling and his frustration mounting, something inside him felt alive for the first time in years. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There was no montage, no inspirational music swelling in the background, no wise teacher appearing to guide him. Just a man in his 40s, alone in a cramped apartment, teaching himself to play piano in the stolen hours between exhaustion and sleep. The learning curve was brutal. His fingers bled sometimes from practicing too long, the soft pads of his fingertips splitting open until he had to wrap them in Band-Aids. His back ached from hunching over the keys, adding new pain to the chronic ache from factory work. His neighbors threatened to call the landlord. Mrs. Chen left a note under his door. "Some of us work normal hours and need to sleep. Have some consideration." His co-workers found out somehow. Word travels in a factory. And they mocked him relentlessly. They started calling him Beethoven, in that sneering way that made it clear they thought he was pathetic. During lunch breaks, sitting in the dingy break room that smelled like burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, they'd make jokes. "Hey Beethoven, play us a song." "Beethoven, when's your concert at Carnegie Hall?" "Beethoven, you give up on that piano yet? Or you still pretending?" He'd smile, say nothing, eat his sandwich, and let their words roll off. But alone, in the bathroom stall, he'd press his forehead against the cold metal door and wonder why he was putting himself through this. The worst part wasn't the mockery. It was the creeping doubt that they were right, that he was delusional, that this dream was just another symptom of a life that hadn't worked out the way it was supposed to. He was 40 years old and alone. No wife, no kids, no career trajectory that meant anything. Just the night shift and the empty apartment, and now this piano that seemed to mock him every time he sat down and couldn't make his fingers do what his brain wanted them to do. He practiced through injuries, through double shifts when the factory was understaffed and they needed bodies on the line, through the kind of bone-deep tiredness that makes your vision blur and your thoughts scatter. He practiced through the Michigan winter, his apartment so cold he could see his breath, wearing fingerless gloves until his fingers warmed up enough to move properly. He practiced through his mother's funeral, coming home from the service in his ill-fitting suit, the one he'd bought at Goodwill and that pulled tight across the shoulders, and sitting at the piano because it was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that felt like it mattered. His mother had died of lung cancer, the same disease that was probably growing in his own lungs right now from the factory fumes. At the funeral, Marcus had given a beautiful eulogy, talking about their mother's sacrifices and her strength. And it was true, all true. But Daniel kept thinking about how she'd spent her whole life cleaning other people's houses, scrubbing other people's toilets, making other people's lives comfortable while her own hands bled and her own back broke. She'd never done anything for herself, never reached for anything beyond survival. And she'd died at 62, worn out, used up, without ever knowing what it felt like to want something just because it made her feel alive. Sitting at her funeral, listening to Marcus talk about practicality and duty, Daniel had made himself a promise. He wouldn't die like that. He wouldn't reach the end without at least trying, even if he failed, even if everyone laughed, even if it made no logical sense. He would try. So he practiced. And slowly, imperceptibly at first, things started to change. The stumbling notes began finding rhythm. The hesitant melodies gained confidence. His fingers built muscle memory, learned to move independently, learned to find the keys without looking. The music went from something he had to think about with painful deliberation to something that started to flow, not easily, but with less resistance, like water finding its way through stone. He practiced through rejection after rejection from local music teachers. He'd called around, swallowed his pride, asked if anyone would take on a beginner his age. Most didn't even return his calls. The ones who did were blunt. "I specialize in children. My rate is $200 an hour, and honestly, at your age, you'd need years of lessons to get to a basic level. Have you considered taking up something else? Maybe golf?" One teacher, a woman with credentials from Juilliard listed on her website, actually met with him. She listened to him play for 5 minutes, stopped him, and said, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, But there's a reason most pianists start at 5 or 6. The neural pathways, the finger development, the ear training, it all needs to happen young. You're starting with handicaps that will always limit you. I wouldn't want to take your money knowing you'll never reach any significant level of proficiency. He'd thanked her, walked back to his car, sat in the parking lot of the strip mall where she taught, and cried. Not gentle tears. Racking sobs that came from somewhere deep in his chest, the kind of crying he hadn't done since he was a child. Because part of him believed her. Part of him thought she was just being honest, telling him what everyone else was too polite to say. He was too old, too late, too far behind. But he went home and practiced anyway. 3 years passed, 3 years of practice in the dark, 3 years of calluses and cramped fingers and neighbors' complaints, 3 years of people asking when he was going to give up this silly phase and accept reality. 3 years of working the night shift, sleeping 4 or 5 hours, waking up to practice, going back to work. His body aged under the strain. His hair went grayer. The lines around his eyes deepened. But Daniel's playing was changing. The stumbling notes were finding rhythm. The hesitant melodies were gaining confidence. He wasn't just learning to play. He was learning who he was supposed to be. He started writing his own music. Simple pieces at first, just chord progressions that sounded nice to his untrained ear. But then more complex things, melodies that captured the loneliness of the factory floor at 2 in the morning, harmonies that spoke of his mother's red, raw hands, rhythms that echoed the mechanical repetition of his life. He couldn't write them down properly. His music theory was self-taught and full of gaps. But he recorded them on his phone, played them over and over, refined them. These weren't pieces anyone would study in a conservatory, but they were his. They were true. And then came the Community Talent Showcase. Someone at the factory had mentioned it. Terry, one of the younger guys who didn't mock Daniel as much as the others, had seen a flyer. "Hey, Beethoven," he'd said, but his tone was different this time, almost friendly. "They're doing this talent show thing at the community center. You should sign up, for real." He'd shown Daniel the flyer on his phone. An open call. Anyone could perform. All ages. All skill levels. Daniel had never performed for anyone. Never even considered it. The thought of standing in front of people, exposing himself like that, made his chest tight and his hands shake. The piano was private. Sacred. His conversation with himself in the dark. Taking it public felt like peeling back skin and showing everyone the raw nerve underneath. But something pushed him to sign up. Maybe it was the need to prove to himself that these 3 years meant something beyond just personal satisfaction. Maybe it was the whisper of that 7-year-old child he'd seen through the music store window 5 years ago, the one who played with freedom and joy, unaware that the world would one day tell him he couldn't. Maybe he was just tired of hiding, tired of keeping this part of himself locked away like it was something shameful. He filled out the online form, selected piano from the drop-down menu, typed his name, Daniel Moss, age 43, piece to be performed, original composition, night shift. He hovered over the submit button for a full minute before clicking it. The confirmation email felt like a point of no return. He told Marcus he was performing. They met for their monthly lunch, a tradition Marcus had insisted on after their mother died, his way of staying connected. Marcus meant well. Daniel knew that. But sitting across from him in the mid-range chain restaurant where they always met, watching Marcus check his phone between bites of his Caesar salad, Daniel felt the gulf between their lives more acutely than ever. "I'm performing in a talent showcase next month," Daniel said, trying to sound casual. Marcus looked up from his phone. Blinked. "Performing what?" "Piano. I'm playing piano." Marcus set his fork down slowly. "Daniel, come on. I've been practicing for 3 years." "I know you have. I hear about it every time we talk. But performing? In public? Marcus leaned forward, lowered his voice like he was explaining something to a child. These things are for kids and people who actually know what they're doing. You're going to embarrass yourself. Is that what you want? I don't know what I want, Daniel said, and it was honest. I just know I need to do this. Marcus sighed, rubbed his temples like Daniel was giving him a headache. I'm trying to protect you. You're my brother. I don't want to see you get hurt. Don't you remember what happened when you tried out for the basketball team in high school? When everyone laughed because you couldn't make a layup? Or when you asked Sarah Mitchell to prom and she laughed in your face in front of everyone? Daniel remembered. He remembered the burning shame of those moments, how they'd carved grooves into his psyche that never quite healed. This is different. How? How is it different? You're setting yourself up to be humiliated. Again. Marcus picked up his fork, speared a piece of lettuce with more force than necessary. Just don't, okay? For your own sake. Enjoy your piano at home. That's enough. It doesn't need to be a thing. Daniel almost backed out. Stood in his apartment that evening, staring at the confirmation email on his phone, thumb hovering over the withdrawal link. He looked at the piano, at his reflection in the dark window beyond it. A middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, and a face that looked older than 43. What was he trying to prove? Who was he trying to impress? Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe this was just going to be another humiliation to add to the collection. Another story of Daniel Moss reaching for something beyond his grasp and falling flat on his face. But then he thought about those 3 years. Those thousands of hours in the dark. All those nights when he chose the piano over sleep, over comfort, over the easy path. He thought about his mother, dying at 62 without ever doing anything just for herself. He thought about the Juilliard teacher telling him he'd never reach any significant level of proficiency. He thought about his co-workers calling him Beethoven with that edge of contempt. And he thought about what it would mean to walk away now, not just from the performance, from himself, from the part of him that had finally woken up after decades of sleep. He closed the email, kept the registration active. The weeks leading up to the performance were torture. Daniel second-guessed everything. The piece he'd chosen felt too simple, then too complex, then too weird. His playing, which had felt decent in his apartment, suddenly sounded amateurish and clumsy. He practiced until his fingers cramped, until the neighbors threatened to call the police, until he was so exhausted he couldn't tell if he was getting better or worse. He lost weight, couldn't sleep. Showed up to his factory shift running on coffee and anxiety. Terry noticed. "You okay, man? You look like hell." "I'm fine," Daniel said, but his hands were shaking as he operated the machinery. "The showcase is this weekend, right?" Daniel nodded. "You're gonna kill it." Terry said it with a confidence Daniel didn't feel. "Seriously, I've heard you play. That time I walked past your apartment and the window was open? You're good, man. Better than you think." Daniel wanted to believe him, but all he could hear was Marcus's voice. All he could see was Sarah Mitchell's face when she'd laughed at his prom invitation. All he could feel was the weight of every failure, every rejection, every moment when he'd reached for something and come up empty. The day of the showcase arrived gray and cold. November in Michigan, the kind of day where the sky presses down like a weight and you can't remember what the sun looks like. Daniel called in sick to work. The first time in 5 years he'd missed a shift for something other than his mother's funeral. He spent the day trying to distract himself, but everything reminded him of the performance looming ahead. He tried to eat and couldn't, tried to practice and his fingers wouldn't cooperate. Tried to watch TV and couldn't focus on the screen. At 4 p.m. he showered, put on his funeral suit, the only nice clothes he owned. Looked at himself in the mirror and saw a man who was about to make a terrible mistake. But he went anyway. The community center was smaller than he'd imagined. A squat brick building with a patched parking lot and a banner hanging over the entrance. Annual Community Talent Showcase. All welcome. Inside it smelled like floor wax and burnt coffee. Folding chairs arranged in uneven rows. A stage that was really just a raised platform with questionable lighting. The audience was mostly families there to support their kids, looking bored and checking their phones while they waited for the show to start. Daniel signed in at the folding table near the entrance. A cheerful woman with a clipboard gave him a name tag. Performer Nabrat 12, written in marker, and directed him to the backstage area. Backstage was a generous term. It was really just a curtained-off section with folding chairs and nervous energy. Kids in dance costumes, teenagers with guitars, a middle-aged woman with a violin. They all looked like they belonged here, like they knew what they were doing. Daniel sat in a folding chair in the corner, hands trembling so badly he had to sit on them. He watched through the gap in the curtain as the show started. A 9-year-old girl performed a ballet routine to Swan Lake. The audience clapped politely. Twin Boys did a comedy sketch that got genuine laughs. A high school band played a rock song with competent enthusiasm. Then the serious performers started. A 12-year-old girl played a Chopin etude with the kind of technical perfection that comes from years of training and natural talent. Every note was crisp, every phrase shaped. She'd probably been playing since she was 4, had a teacher who charged $200 an hour, had parents who drove her to competitions and recitals. The audience gave her a standing ovation. Daniel felt sick. A teenager shredded on electric guitar, playing some metal song with speed and aggression that would have taken Daniel decades to learn, if he could learn it at all. The audience loved it. More standing ovations. More proof that talent was real, that some people had it and some people didn't. What was he doing here? He was 43 years old, self-taught, playing an original composition nobody had ever heard, following acts that had actual skill, actual training, actual reasons to be on that stage. He was a factory worker who'd bought a cheap piano and thought 3 years of practice in the dark was enough. He was about to embarrass himself in front of hundreds of people. Marcus was right. This was a mistake. His name was called. Next up, Daniel Moss, performing an original piano composition. Scattered applause. The kind you give out of politeness, not interest. The kind that says, "We're here for our kids, not for you." Daniel stood, legs unsteady, and walked toward the stage. The curtain parted. The lights were brighter than he expected. Hotter. They hit his face like accusation. He could barely see the audience, but he could feel them. Their indifference, their impatience, their silent question. Who is this guy? He walked across the stage, it felt like miles, and sat down at the piano. A better instrument than he'd ever touched. A proper grand piano, shiny black, probably worth more than his car. His hands found the keys. They felt cool and smooth. Foreign. Nothing like the yellowed, sticky keys of his practice piano. He took a breath, positioned his fingers, and that's when he heard it. That first laugh, sharp and sudden like a door slamming, coming from somewhere in the third row. A man's voice, not even trying to hide it. Just a full, open laugh at the sight of Daniel sitting at that piano in his too-tight suit, with his gray hair and his trembling hands. And then the others joining in. A woman's giggle. Someone else's snicker. The sound spread through the audience like wildfire catching, and Daniel's whole body went cold. The cruelty of that moment is hard to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. It wasn't just mockery. It was confirmation of every fear he'd carried for 3 years, every doubt that had whispered in his ear at 3 in the morning, every voice that told him he was too old, too late, too foolish, too much of a joke to take seriously. In that laughter, he could hear Marcus saying, "Be realistic." He could hear his co-workers calling him Beethoven with that edge of contempt. He could hear the Juilliard teacher explaining he'd never reach any significant level of proficiency. He could hear his father saying the world doesn't owe you nothing. He could hear Sarah Mitchell laughing when he asked her to prom. He could hear every person who'd ever made him feel small. His fingers froze above the keys. His vision blurred. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. The laughter grew louder. Someone in the back made a comment he couldn't quite hear, but it got more laughs. This was it. This was the humiliation Marcus had warned him about. This was the universe telling him to stay in his lane. He could walk off. Right now. Stand up, leave the stage, go home, sell the piano, and never speak of this again. It would be easier, less painful in the long run. He could go back to just being the night shift guy at the factory. The quiet one who kept his head down and didn't reach for things that weren't meant for him. But here's what they didn't know. Here's what the people in that audience laughing at him like he was the punchline to a joke they all understood couldn't see. Daniel Moss had spent 3 years learning how to fail. 3 years of hitting wrong notes in the dark and playing anyway. 3 years of sounding terrible and showing up the next day. 3 years of his neighbors banging on walls and him continuing to play. 3 years of his fingers bleeding and him wrapping them up and practicing through the pain. 3 years of rejection and mockery and doubt, and every single day choosing to sit down at those keys anyway. He'd already been broken. The factory had broken him. The loneliness had broken him. His mother's funeral had broken him. The years of sleepwalking through a life that felt like someone else's, like a coat that never quite fit, that had broken him piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. And he'd put himself back together, note by note, in the dark hours of the night with no one watching and no one caring. This laughter, this mockery from people who would forget his name by tomorrow, it was just noise. And Daniel had learned how to find music in noise. His jaw clenched, his shoulders squared, and his fingers, those factory-worn, trembling 43-year-old fingers that every teacher had said were too old to learn, pressed down into the keys. Not the tentative touch of someone seeking approval. Not the hesitant touch of someone who might stop if the laughter got louder. The firm, deliberate touch of someone who had already decided, who had already won, whether this room knew it or not. He wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for the 40-year-old man who walked past that music store window and felt something crack open in his chest. Something he'd thought was dead. Something that whispered, maybe it's not too late. He was playing for every late night when his hands bled, and he kept going. For every rejection from teachers who couldn't see past his age. For every person who told him to be realistic. For his mother, who died without ever reaching for anything just because it made her feel alive. For the part of himself that had been asleep for decades, and finally woke up. He was playing because this was who he was now, and no amount of laughter could take that away. The piece he'd written, Night Shift, wasn't technically complex. He knew his limitations, knew he'd never play Rachmaninoff or Liszt, knew conservatory students could sight-read circles around him. But this piece was his. Born from those dark hours alone with the keys, every note was earned. It started soft, almost fragile. The melody line represented the quiet before a factory shift starts, that moment when you're standing in the parking lot and you can still pretend you have choices. Then the left hand came in, a steady, repetitive rhythm like machinery, like the conveyor belt that never stops, like time passing whether you want it to or not. The melody wove around this rhythm, sometimes breaking free, sometimes getting swallowed by it, always searching for something beyond the mechanical repetition. The middle section grew darker, minor chords, dissonance. This was the part that represented 3 a.m. on the factory floor, when exhaustion makes reality feel thin, when you're so tired you forget who you are, when you're just a body operating machinery, a cog in a system that doesn't see you as human. The music became harsh here, almost angry, the left hand pounding out the rhythm with more force, while the right hand played fragmented melodies that couldn't quite resolve. But then, and this was the part Daniel had worked on for months, rewriting and refining until it felt true, the melody found its way out. Slowly at first, a small phrase that repeated, growing stronger each time. The harsh rhythm began to soften, to transform, to become something that supported the melody instead of fighting it. The music opened up into something that wasn't quite joy but was hope, was possibility, was the feeling of sitting at a piano at midnight in your tiny apartment and realizing that you're becoming someone you didn't know you could be. The piece spoke of loneliness, yes, of factory floors and empty apartments and hands that ache and backs that break. But it also spoke of transformation, of finding beauty in unexpected places, of discovering that it's never too late to become who you're supposed to be, of playing in the dark until the dark becomes light. The laughter had faded. Slowly at first, like people weren't sure if they should stop. Then, completely. The room filled with something else, something the audience wasn't expecting and didn't know how to process. They'd come ready to be entertained by children or impressed by prodigies. They'd come prepared to check their phones and chat with their neighbors and applaud politely at appropriate moments. They hadn't come prepared for honesty, for vulnerability, for a middle-aged factory worker pouring his entire soul onto those keys, holding nothing back, laying himself bare in front of strangers who'd just been laughing at him. Someone in the front row stopped checking their phone. The screen went dark in their hand as they leaned forward. Then someone else. The bored father in the fourth row shifted forward in his seat, suddenly paying attention. The mother who'd been shushing her kid went still, her hand frozen in mid-air. The teenagers in the back who'd been whispering to each other stopped talking. The sound in the room changed from the ambient noise of a bored audience to something else entirely. Attention. Real attention. Note by note, Daniel was rewriting the room. Not through virtuosity. He'd never have that. Not through technical perfection. There were mistakes, moments where his fingers stumbled. But they didn't matter because the emotion was true. He was rewriting the room through honesty, through the simple act of being completely, vulnerably himself. His eyes were closed now. He'd stopped seeing the audience entirely. In his mind, he was back in his apartment at 2 a.m, exhausted from his shift, fingers finding the keys in the dark, like a man finding home. He was remembering why he started. Not for applause, not for validation, not to prove anything to anyone, but because the piano was the first thing in his life that felt like his. That felt like truth. That made the years of factory work and loneliness and slow suffocation feel worth it because at least he'd found this one thing, this one piece of himself that no one could take away. The music built to its climax. The melody soared over the rhythm, free now, no longer fighting against the machinery but transforming it, making it part of the song instead of the enemy. This was the part that represented the moment when you realize you've become someone new, when you look in the mirror and recognize yourself for the first time in decades. The left hand and right hand finally moved together, in harmony, supporting each other, creating something neither could create alone. And then the resolution. The final phrase. The melody settling into place like a key turning in a lock, like coming home, like finding the answer to a question you didn't know how to ask. The last chord held in the air. Daniel let it ring, sustaining the pedal, letting every overtone and harmonic bloom in the space, and then slowly, fading into silence. The final note dissolved. Daniel's hands lifted from the keys. He opened his eyes. The room was completely still. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence was so profound it felt physical, like the space itself was holding its breath. For a moment Daniel thought he'd failed. thought the stillness was shock at how bad it was, thought the silence was just them trying to figure out how to respond to something so awkward, so embarrassing. But then, from somewhere in the middle rows, someone started clapping. Just one person. Slow at first. Deliberate. Each clap distinct and clear in the silence. Then faster. Then someone else joined in. And then someone else. And then, like a dam breaking, the entire room erupted. Not polite applause. Not the scattered clapping they'd given the other performers. Real applause. The kind that comes from witnessing something that matters. The kind that's not about politeness or obligation but about genuine response to genuine emotion. People were standing. The father in the fourth row was on his feet, clapping hard. The mother in the front row was crying, tears streaming down her face, though she probably couldn't explain why. The teenagers in the back were standing. The 12-year-old girl who'd played Chopin was standing. Even the performers backstage were clapping, their faces visible through the gap in the curtain. Daniel stood up from the piano bench, and his legs almost gave out. He grabbed the edge of the piano to steady himself. The applause washed over him like a wave, and he felt something in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Not pride, exactly. Something deeper. Recognition. The feeling of being seen, of being heard, of mattering. But here's the thing about that moment. The applause wasn't the victory. The standing ovation wasn't the point. Because Daniel had already won. He'd won 3 years ago when he bought that $200 piano and decided to try. He'd won every night he came home exhausted and practiced anyway. He'd won when the music teachers turned him away and he taught himself. He'd won when his neighbors complained and he kept playing. He'd won when Marcus laughed and he signed up anyway. He'd won when that audience laughed and he pressed his fingers to the keys instead of running away. The audience was just finding out. He walked off the stage in a daze. People stopped him. Strangers. The woman who'd been crying grabbed his hand. "That was beautiful," she said. "I don't know why I'm crying, but that was the most beautiful thing I've heard in years." The father from the fourth row shook his hand, said something about inspiration, about never being too late. The 12-year-old Chopin prodigy looked at him with something like respect and said, "You wrote that yourself?" The people who'd laughed? Some of them came up to him afterward, suddenly interested, suddenly supportive, suddenly full of questions about his journey and his passion and his courage. He was polite to them, gracious even. But he knew the truth. Their approval meant nothing now. They'd laughed when it mattered, when he was vulnerable, when he needed support. They only cared now because he'd succeeded despite them, not because of them. They wanted to be part of the story now that it had a happy ending, but they'd been part of the mockery when the ending was uncertain. His brother Marcus called him the next day. "I saw the video," he said. Someone had filmed the performance and posted it online. It had a few thousand views already, people sharing it with captions like "Never Too Late" and "Proof that Dreams Don't Expire." "I was wrong," Marcus said, and his voice had something in it Daniel had never heard before. Not pity, not condescension, respect. "I was wrong, Daniel. I'm sorry." And Daniel appreciated that. He did. But he also understood something Marcus didn't. The apology was for Marcus, not for Daniel. It was Marcus trying to reconcile his own guilt, his own fear that maybe he'd stopped reaching for things too early in his own life. Daniel had already forgiven him 3 years ago when he decided to try anyway. The forgiveness wasn't about Marcus deserving it. It was about Daniel refusing to let other people's doubts become his prison. The video spread. Not virally, not millions of views. But enough. Local news stations picked it up. Factory worker learns piano at 40. Stuns audience. The story made the rounds on feel-good morning shows and inspirational Facebook pages. People reached out. Some were genuine. Musicians who'd also started late. People who said his story gave them courage to try. Others wanted to attach themselves to his success, to be seen with the guy from the video, to claim they'd always believed in him even though Daniel had never met them before. He learned to tell the difference. He learned that the people who matter are the ones who show up in the dark, not in the spotlight. Terry from the factory, who'd encouraged him to sign up, who'd said for real like he meant it. Terry mattered. Mrs. Chen from 3B, who'd complained about the noise but left a card under his door after seeing the video that just said, "I understand now." She mattered. The people who'd laughed and then wanted to claim they'd been supportive all along, they didn't matter. They never had. That night changed Daniel's life, but not in the way you might think. He didn't become famous, didn't land a record deal, didn't quit the factory and become a concert pianist. Real life isn't a movie. The bills still needed paying. The night shift still needed working. The apartment was still cramped, and the piano still had yellowed keys, and the fumes at the factory still settled in his lungs like they always had. But something fundamental shifted. Daniel started teaching, not in some fancy studio, in his apartment. Word spread in the neighborhood. Kids mostly at first. But then adults started reaching out. People who'd always wanted to learn but thought they were too old, too late, too realistic. A 47-year-old accountant who wanted to play her late mother's favorite song. A 62-year-old widower who discovered that music could fill silence in ways nothing else could. A 17-year-old kid who everyone said wasn't talented enough for music school, but who just needed someone to tell him that talent isn't given, it's built. Daniel would look at them on their first day, seeing their doubt, their fear, their certainty that they'd already missed their chance, and he'd tell them the same thing every time. The room is going to laugh, maybe not out loud, maybe just in your head, but it's going to laugh. Your family might laugh. Your friends might laugh. That voice inside you that sounds like every person who ever told you to be realistic, that voice will definitely laugh. And that's when you play anyway. You play through the laughter. You play through the doubt. You play because this is yours, and no one gets to take it from you. Years passed. Daniel kept working at the factory, kept playing his piano, kept teaching. The story of his performance faded from local memory the way all stories do. Life moved on. The video got buried under newer viral moments, newer inspirational stories, newer examples of people overcoming odds. But the students he taught? They remembered. They carried forward what he'd shown them. Not perfect technique, not conservatory polish, but something more important. The courage to try when the world says it's too late. 10 years after that performance, Daniel still works at the factory. Still plays his piano. His apartment isn't empty anymore. He's got a couple of rescue cats that curl up on the piano bench while he plays, and walls covered in photos from student recitals. The piano he bought for $200 is still there, keys still yellowed, but now it sits next to a better one he saved up for. Both get played. Both matter. The cheap one reminds him where he started. The nicer one shows him how far he's come. He thinks sometimes about that night, about the laughter, about the moment his fingers froze above the keys, about how close he came to walking away, and he's grateful for it now. Not because the laughter didn't hurt, it did. It burned like fire, like every failure and rejection he'd ever experienced concentrated into a single moment. But because it taught him the most important lesson he'd ever learn, that the opinion of people who laugh at your dreams means nothing, that the only approval that matters is your own, that you can be 43 years old with trembling hands and no training and still become who you were meant to be. The people who laughed that night, Daniel doesn't think about them much anymore. Some of them probably don't even remember. It was just another local talent show, another Tuesday night, another moment that felt significant to him but was forgettable to them. But for Daniel, It was the moment he discovered that he was stronger than their doubt, that his dream was bigger than their laughter, that he could fall and get back up and keep playing anyway. There's a video of that performance still floating around online. If you watch it carefully, you can see the exact moment the laughter stops. You can see the shift in the audience, the way they lean forward, the way their faces change from mockery to attention to something like awe. But more importantly, you can see the shift in Daniel. The moment he decides, the moment he stops playing for them and starts playing for himself. That's the moment that changed everything. Not when they started clapping, when he decided their laughter didn't matter. He's 53 now. Hands still tremble a bit. Factory fumes still in his lungs. Back still aches from years of physical labor. But when he sits down at that piano, none of that matters. He's not the factory worker anymore. He's not the punchline. He's not the cautionary tale. He's the man who played anyway. The man who built his dream in the dark. The man who taught himself that it's never too late to become who you're supposed to be. And the people who laughed? They're not laughing anymore. Not because Daniel proved them wrong, though he did, but because he proved something more important. He proved that their laughter was irrelevant, that their permission was never required, that the only person who needed to believe in Daniel Moss was Daniel Moss. Some nights, after his students have gone home, after the factory shift doesn't start for a few hours, after the cats have settled in for the evening, Daniel sits at his piano in the quiet apartment and plays. Not for an audience. Not for applause. Not to prove anything to anyone. He plays because this is who he is now. Because that 40-year-old man who walked past the music store window and felt something crack open in his chest was right. Because the hands that tremble are the same hands that can create beauty. Because dreams don't have expiration dates unless you let them. The laughter doesn't echo anymore. It's been replaced by something stronger. By music. By purpose. By the quiet satisfaction of becoming the person you were meant to be against every odd. By the knowledge that the room can laugh all it wants, but it can't stop you from playing. It never could. That's the real story. Not the applause at the end. The choice in the middle. The moment when the laughter was loudest and the fingers pressed down anyway. That's when Daniel won. Everything after was just the world catching up. So here's what I want to know. What have they told you that you can't do? What dream are you carrying in the dark, too afraid to bring into the light because you know they'll laugh? What version of yourself are you keeping hidden because you've been told you're too old, too late, too unrealistic? What piano are you not buying because someone said the boat already sailed? Tell me in the comments below. Let me know where in the world you're watching from. And if this story touched you, if it reminded you that the laughter doesn't get to write your ending, subscribe and leave a like. Because silence always comes before glory. And your moment is coming. They might be laughing now, but they won't be laughing for long.